From the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C., this is the Tyler's Place podcast, brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Council of the World. I'm your host, Maynard Edwards, 32nd degree KCCH. Thank you so much for joining us. Podcast at scottishrite.org. That's where you can email us at any time. Podcast at scottishrite.org. Here we find ourselves at the holidays, and it's a time to get it together with friends, with family, and of course, brothers. And one of the things I always look forward to each year here at the House of the Temple is we have a lot of employees and friends and brothers who are dispersed all over the country doing the work of the Scottish Rite. And at the holiday, we get a chance to kind of bring them back to Washington, D.C. to hang out with them and get to see them, because we only get to see them a couple of times a year. Sometimes several years will go between visits with some of these good friends and brothers. And one of my favorite guys to sit down with, I haven't spoken to him, I guess, since August when he was in town for the biennial session, is Brother Chuck Morgan. Now, Brother Chuck was good friends with our past Sovereign Grand Commander Ronald A. Seal, and he told us a few tall tales about Grand Commander Seal. But this time, he's in town and here for a little holiday cheer. And he has been traveling across the country talking about the Benjamin French Albert Pike sword that we spoke about back in August. And if you'll listen to the August podcast, you'll hear all about that. But in researching the sword, Brother Chuck found out some other stories, so we had a chance to sit down and get a really neat story, not only about some more follow-up on that fantastic sword, but also about Albert Pike's book collection. So, Brother Chuck, thank you for joining us, and Merry Christmas to you.
Well, Merry Christmas to you, Brother Maynard Edwards. It's always good to be with you.
We had a nice dinner last night, a bunch of us, because Chuck's in town for the annual Supreme Council Christmas party, so we were blessed to be able to have a little dinner with Chuck last night, and that was a fun time, and that's really what the fraternity is about, getting together with good folks and sharing some time.
Absolutely.
Now, in this, Chuck has been known to tell a few what we might call fishing tales, but I'm not going to focus on one of those. This is a real tale of Scottish Rite history that you sort of uncovered. The last time you were on the program, we talked a little bit about a sword that was given to Albert Pike by a very famous Mason, and let's recap that story very quickly for folks who might have missed that one.
Yeah. Well, the sword story really starts with the relationship between Albert Pike and Benjamin French, who, of course, was a very famous Mason, Grand Master of Masons here in Washington, D.C., and was a member of the Lincoln administration during the Civil War, while, of course, Pike was a Confederate brigadier general. And during that time period, at some point during that time period, Benjamin French presented Pike with a presentation sword, which is really beautiful, and we were able to acquire it, and it now rests here in our Albert Pike Museum here at the House of the Temple. You'd love to see it if you come up here. But in researching that sword, I ran across a lot of other interesting little tidbits, both about the relationship between Pike and Benjamin French, the sword, and even a few other things that a lot of folks don't realize that took place during the Civil War period, that evidences the real bond of brotherhood between Freemasons who were even on opposite sides during that conflict.
And the one that you told us last night that really kind of piqued my curiosity was Brother Pike's books. Now, his book collection is a sight to behold. We have a lot of his collection here on display at the House of the Temple, and it's everything from Shakespeare to anatomical books. I mean, the man's curiosity knew no bounds. But fill me in a little bit on the story that you've been kind of traveling around telling.
Well, as part of the sword presentation program, I love to go to valleys and do about a 30-minute valley program on the Albert Pike presentation sword. And as part of that program, I tell them a little bit about these books because the books have a part in the story of the sword even. After the Civil War, of course, Pike made numerous attempts to try and regain his citizenship as an American citizen, and his friend Benjamin French did a lot to help him eventually get his citizenship back. During that period, and particularly in 1865, Pike, for a period of time, was in Canada. And with the help of Benjamin French, he was able to get a pass to return to Little Rock, Arkansas, which is where his home was. And so he did. In August of 1865, he returned to Arkansas. The pass was actually issued to him in late August 1865. When he got back to Little Rock, of course, the Union Army was occupying Little Rock. The war was over, but this was Reconstruction. And they had seized his home, seized a lot of his personal effects, and had sold them. As spoils of war, if you want to look at it that way. And, of course, Pike was real concerned about that and very unhappy about that. But he went to see the commanding officer of the Union Army there in Little Rock, who was in charge of that occupation, and his name was Colonel Thomas Hart Benton. Now, this is not the same Thomas Hart Benton that was later a news publisher and politician. This Thomas Hart Benton was from Iowa, and he was a colonel in the 29th Iowa Infantry. And when Pike went to see him, this colonel had heard of Pike and knew something about his history and his history in Masonry. And he told Pike, well, he said, I have saved all of your books. He took the books out of Pike's home before they sold the home and stored them. And said, Pike, of course, immediately said, well, I'd love to have my books back. Whereupon Colonel Benton said, well, I'm going to give them back to you. And he gave them back to him. And, of course, a lot of these books we have here at the House of the Temple as part of the Pike collection are those books, those very books. And the sort of the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say, is that
you're dating yourself now, brother.
Colonel Thomas Hart Benton at that time was the Grand Master of Masons in the state of Iowa. And obviously there was another Masonic connection between adversaries in probably the most horrible conflict our nation's ever been involved in. But the bonds of Freemasonry prevailed, and he saved Pike's books, which are now part of our library.
And it's certainly a lesson for all of us listening today as we're here at the holiday season and we're reflecting, we're at a time of great political turmoil in our nation, and it's easy to let those divides come between brothers, but I think we all need to remember that if those men in that time could honor their Masonic bond and honor their Masonic word to be brothers first and everything else second, I think we've got no right to disappoint them.
Absolutely. It's kind of interesting that, of course, not too long after Pike returned to Little Rock, he then returned back to Washington, D.C. And I'll just give you one other little vignette of the relationship between Pike and the Masonic fraternity here in Washington. When he returned to Washington in the fall of 1865, he went to a constitution of a new Knights Templar chapter here in Washington, and his old friend, Benjamin French, was the installing officer. And this was the first time, now they had corresponded because French had helped him try and get his citizenship back, and they had done a lot of correspondence, but this was the first time that French and Pike had actually been together. Wow. Since the Civil War had ended. And French wrote in his diary, and I won't bore you with a big long read here, but just a brief entry from his diary of November 12, 1865. French says, in the evening I went down and constituted the Columbia Commandery number 1 as a proxy for our Grand Master. Albert Pike was present, and I saw him for the first time since the close of the war. I was really glad to see him and greeted him cordially. Which really shows the continuing relationship they had with one another.
Yeah, and sometimes you think about these guys and you wonder if they were just ships passing in the night, but it really seems like these two brothers had a real relationship, and that's good.
Well, it's a touching story. I love to tell it. I love to go do these programs for valleys, valley events that would be interested in that. It's a PowerPoint slide program, but you get to see a lot of the pictures of the sword and the individuals involved.
Now, I'm going to ask you two more questions. The first I'm going to ask you in your capacity as a member of the development team. And one of Chuck's jobs is to go around the country, talk to people, talk about the House of the Temple, talk about our collection, talk about fine things like our swords and our books, and to try and help raise money to support and preserve and research our Scottish Rite and Masonic heritage throughout the world. That's one of his big jobs. And one of the ways we do that, and I know that you're big in this, is the Acacia Guild, which we haven't talked about enough here on the podcast. And this is a really neat program that allows you in a, let's say, a more comfortable way, a more affordable way, to make a significant contribution to the Scottish Rite building and charities and so on.
Well, the interesting thing about the Acacia Guild is that it's a fairly recent program that we instituted in May of 2018, which allows for membership by donation of $1,000 per year. Now, that immediately, some people say, "Oh,
too much, too rich for my blood."
Yeah, too rich for my blood. But the thing that's good about this program is that you don't have to pay it all at once. You can put it on an ACH through your bank account, or you can put it on a credit card and make payments of $83.33 a month. And with that very first payment, you become a member of the Acacia Guild. You don't have to wait till the whole $1,000 is paid, and they will send you the beautiful Acacia Guild medallion, which is sterling silver, has the sprig of acacia on the front of it.
It's beautiful.
And a number on the back, which is your own specific individual number as a member of the Guild. And then each year, if you decide you want to renew it, which that's up to you, if you decide you want to renew it each year, you'll receive a silver star that you can put on the ribbon that holds the medallion. We have already signed up well over 200 brethren in this program, and it's something I think you'd really enjoy, and it's really a pleasure to wear. It's fun when folks see it. They want to know what it is.
This allows you to make a significant contribution over a period of time such that you can support at a level that you would like to in a manner that's not going to break your budget.
This particular program, 50% of the funds raised go to the House of the Temple Historic Preservation Foundation for such things as preservation and rebuilding of the temple campaign, etc. And the other 50% of the money goes into the Scottish Rite Foundation for the Southern Jurisdiction, which, of course, as you know, is the entity that helps support, initiate, and operate a number of Rite Care centers all across the Southern Jurisdiction. So it's a 50-50 deal. You're not giving it all to one place.
If you want to learn more about the Acacia Guild or any of the giving programs we have through the Scottish Rite, you can simply visit scottishrite.org and click on Giving, and you'll find information about all the different ways that you can deepen your legacy within the Scottish Rite. Brother Chuck Morgan, thank you again for joining us. Switching gears, we're going to chat now with our educational correspondent, Brother Mark Oldknow, 33rd Degree. He's the personal representative from the Valley of Santa Fe, and he joins us now to continue his discussion of leadership and virtue and their relationship to each other. Brother Mark.
The virtue that I'd like to look at today is the virtue of empathy. Empathy represents the ability to understand and thereby share another person's perspective. It's different from sympathy. So sympathy comes from the root word sim, meaning same. And sympathy is an emotion. It's simply a shared feeling. You can see how it's emotion because it tends to be fairly constrained. So sympathy is often simply pity. Sometimes it's pride, but even when it's pride, it's hard to have prideful sympathy with somebody who you're not already somehow connected to. So empathy is different in the regard that M means in. And so you're literally pulling yourself into the perspective of what the other person is feeling or thinking or experiencing. It's distinctly not a feeling. It's a It's a position of knowledge. It's a position of inquiry. It's a way of looking at things. It's adopting another person's perspective. So once again, it's, metaphorically, it's that ability to walk in somebody else's shoes, to see from their eyes, looking through their glasses. One of the ways that the word empathy shows up historically is when we refer to an empath. And originally, that meant somebody who actually displayed the wounds of Christ. Empathy is also the foundation of the golden rule. How you do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You have to be able to see from their perspective. You have to be able to understand what it is that they would want done to them. This is a great virtue if we can develop it in ourselves that allow us to step outside of ourselves and thereby put us into a better position to be able to serve in whatever context that may be. One of the things that I'm committed to doing here in these episodes as we're looking at virtue is I'd like to pause at the very end to give some simple suggestions about practices that you can do over the next month. Just easy little sidebar things that you can do to begin to look at the role of the virtue in your own life and to begin to become more sensitive to it, to develop it in yourself. And so what I'd like to suggest for empathy here, besides just the practice of the golden rule, which is always a good thing to do, even outside of the context of this, always practice the golden rule. Just because somebody has an opinion or a perspective that is different from yours, be it political, be it religious, be it fraternal, be it even just in your marriage or your relationship with your kids or with a friend, there's always different perspectives. But just because somebody has something and feels passionate about it doesn't make them now necessarily wrong. God knows it doesn't make them necessarily evil. It just makes them somehow different from you. And it's that difference, that feeling of other that we end up reacting to. And if we examine that sense of other, that sense of being different in ourselves, when we're experiencing it, we can control it a little bit better. So the first thing that you really need to practice over the next month or so is looking at yourself when you're reacting to somebody. When somebody says something and you just sit there and say, no, that's wrong. Can you, just for the sake of argument, pause and find something in what they said or the position that they're offering that is in fact a good thing, a thing that you can agree with, or at the very least, a thing that you can understand and maybe begin to appreciate. You'll begin to find that you look at that person differently. They become more complex. They're less easy to simply write off or discard. You're building a relationship with that person, and that relationship is defined by empathy. You're beginning to see through their eyes a little bit. So always pause when you're feeling that difference with another person. Ask yourself, first and foremost, what may we have in common? I truly believe, brethren, that 99.9% of the human beings wandering this earth, and that's an awful lot of human beings, really, really want to do the right thing. They want to be good. They're struggling just like you and I are to figure out what the right thing to do in any given circumstance is. And as frail and the foibles of being human, we often make decisions that aren't the best or aren't for the greater good or are narrow or confused, but we don't do it because we're purposely setting out to hurt somebody or to be evil or to do something that's wrong. So believing in your brothers and sisters that somehow or another, even though we may all be confused, that we are trying to do the right thing is the first stepping stone. That recognition is the first step to developing empathy and to developing an empathic context. Please practice that. I think it's a tool that if we bring it to bear in our relationships with each other fraternally, in our relationships with our loved ones, in our relationships in the greater society and politics, that we can really benefit. We can bring from our Scottish Rite teachings and its emphasis on virtue, we can help bring a contribution, a little bit better to the world and to our own lives. Brethren, on behalf of the Valley of Santa Fe, of Deputy Wes Thornton, and the entire Orient of New Mexico, and myself, Merry, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Happy holidays, brethren. Peace.
That's Brother Mark Oldknow, 33rd Degree from the Valley of Santa Fe. If you've got a question or comment for Brother Mark, send it to podcast@scottishrite.org. Time for Tyler's Trivia now on the Tyler's Place podcast. I'm your host, Maynard Edwards, 32nd Degree KCCH, and our erstwhile Grand Archivist nowhere to be found. He travels a lot at the holidays, so we are missing him at this moment in time. However, we have a very suitable substitute, the illustrious S. Brent Morris, joining me. Hasn't been on the podcast in a little while. And we got to talking about the Scottish Rite Research Society, which Art and I talk about once in a while. And Brent, I think of it as the best $50 in all of Scottish Rite Masonry.
Well, actually, it's 55.
Oh, well, all right.
Full disclosure, I don't want someone to try to join and show up with $50 and be disappointed. The Scottish Rite Research Society began with my frustration in trying to promote the Philalethes Society. Now, I was executive secretary of the Philalethes Society. I think I started in 78 or 79, and I served for about 6 years. And that happens to be one of the aspects of Freemasonry that I most enjoy. That is to say, research topics on Masonic history. I love digging into the details. I like seeing footnotes and citations. I like tracking down legends and rumors and what's the truth behind it. What are the details of the real story? I mean, that turns me on. And so when I was executive secretary of the Philalethes Society, boy, I thought we had one of the best products that was available in the United States. And no one had heard of us, and no one would sign up. And it was just a constant matter of frustration. And I remember after I stepped down, so I guess this was about 85 or so, 84, 85, I kept thinking, how could we promote it better? And one of the things that occurred to me, then this was as I was getting more active and more interested in Scottish Rite Masonry, I was impressed at the membership at that time. It was over 400,000. They had a monthly magazine, The New Age, that went out, and I thought, boy, if there were some way we could tie the New Age magazine and bring in people interested in what I was interested in. You're always looking for people that are interested in what you're interested in. I mean, if your favorite is hot fudge sundaes, then you want to start a hot fudge sundae society. So I got this idea. I went to one of my first Scottish Rite leadership conferences, and I was impressed that they got a couple hundred guys to show up at the House of the Temple. Ernest Borgnine was the speaker that year, so that was quite a thrill. And I thought to myself, we could have some kind of a research group meeting the night before or the night after the leadership conference. It was a one-day thing. You show up at 9 o'clock on Saturday, you wrap up about 4 o'clock on Saturday and go home. And I thought how easy it would be to work in a research society meeting. Then John Betcher became managing editor of the Scottish Rite Journal in 1989. We hit it off very well. I put together a formal proposal which he helped present to Grand Commander Kleinknecht, and he said, let's give it a try. Now, one of the little-known things about the Scottish Rite Research Society is that very early in the process, we made a proposal to the Northern Masonic jurisdiction that we create a research lodge of perfection jointly chartered by both Supreme Councils that had the ability or had the charter to roam and meet anywhere in the United States. And the idea would be that we'd have regional meetings, 3 or 4 times a year. We would produce annual transactions. That's what became Heredom. Well, the Northern Masonic jurisdiction turned down our offer to have both a research lodge of perfection, and they were not even interested in participating in a research society. They didn't think this was a program that would be successful or helpful to Masonry. So we went off on our own. And I remember it was at the this was, I believe, the 1991 session of the Supreme Council. We had a meeting up in the Temple Room with the charter members. I presented the first paper, Why 33, and that kicked it off. And we had bumps at the beginning. Initially, Fred Kleinkeneck said, "Don't waste your time publishing anything. We've got to get new members, focus on that." Then all of a sudden he said, "Where's that book you promised us?" And I thought to myself, "Sir, you told me not to do anything with publication, so I took you at your word." So then we had this frantic mad dash to get the first volume of Herodom out. And I think we're working now on volume 27, and we have a pretty good track record. And so that's the early origins and how the Research Society got started.
It's an excellent way to, if you're just beginning a path of Masonic study and Masonic research, it's an excellent vetted first step, because a lot of times when you begin the path of Masonic research, and Art and I have talked about this, it's difficult to figure out which books are legit and which books are better as kindling. But with the Research Society, it's a great jumping off point especially for men who are just getting into Freemasonry, just learning to find some sources that are vetted in order to whet their appetite for further Masonic study.
I agree with you entirely on that. There is much material out there that is far more romantic than it is fact-based. It is the fact-based articles or the ones that turn me on, not the romantic articles. Though it's amusing sometimes when you look at the things that people have believed or wanted to believe. Just as one example is the Knight Templar theory that became incredibly popular in the early 90s with John Robinson, who put out Born in Blood, a wonderfully well-written book with no footnotes or references at all. I'm not convinced by the data he presents, but boy, did he convince a lot of other people. So there's just one example.
So the Research Society now, the Herodom, and in fact your article, Y33, was recently reprinted in one of them, and Volume 1 is now available again in limited quantities. If you go to the Scottish Rite store at scottishrite.org, you'll see the little icon for the store up in the top there. You can check it out and join the Research Society there. It is, like I've said and Brent said, best $55 in all of Freemasonry, because you get Herodom, which in and of itself is worth what you're paying for it. And then there's a bonus book every year. Any hint at any upcoming bonus books, or are those played pretty close to the vest?
Well, I can give you some hints. Right now, the bonus book for 2019 is going to be a collection of essays on Cernoism. Joseph Cerno was a member of the Order of the Royal Secret in Cuba. He moved to New York City. I think it was in 1806, 1807. And he started the Sovereign Grand Consistory of Sublime Princes of the Royal Secret. I believe that was the name of his group.
That's interesting that's interesting that is what's coming out, because there are new groups popping up on Facebook touting their ties to Cerno Freemasonry, and they're operating in New York and Ohio and a few other places, operating as Cerno Freemasons now.
Wow. Well, I know that there was a breakaway Grand Lodge in Ohio, and I believe the mainstream Grand Lodge in Ohio is Free and Accepted Masons, and the breakaway group was Ancient Free and Accepted Masons. And these were men that were pushed out of Ohio Masonry because they refused to give up their Cerno Supreme Council. In fact, it may be worth a couple of minutes to tell you that story. Cernoism starts with the Sovereign Consistory in New York City back at the beginning of the 19th century. Eventually, the Cerno Supreme Council merged with the Northern Masonic jurisdiction in 1867, and everything was sweetness and light for not quite 15 years. Then I believe it was in 1881, the Cerno Supreme Council is reactivated, and it starts spreading aggressively. And it achieves its spread by, I think, two reasons. The first one was dissatisfaction with the current deputies of the Supreme Council, the current SGIGs in both the northern and southern jurisdiction. You'll always find people that are unhappy. And then the Cernoists presented a reasonable historical argument that they were the sole legitimate source of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And so with those two things presented to them, the new members, the potential members, had a chance to do something. Now, what happens in Ohio, in New England Lodge number 4 in Worthington, they have an election for master. A guy's elected master, and I don't remember which side he was on, but the other side steals the charter and goes and hides it. So I think it may have been a Cernoist that was elected master, then the NMJ members stole the charter, or the NMJ guys were elected master and the Cernoist stole the charter. At this point, the Grand Lodge of Ohio steps in, and they basically said, as long as you guys were playing nicely in the sandbox, we didn't care. Now that you're kicking sand on the adults that are sitting around the sandbox, we can't put up with this. They looked over the data, and on whatever basis they had available, they said the Cernoists are illegitimate. The NMJ is the only legitimate Scottish Rite. If you do not resign from the Cerno Supreme Council by a fixed date, then we're going to expel you for Masonry. Well, the Cernoists sued, and the Grand Lodge lost at trial.
So the American way. We don't like it, we're going to sue you.
That's right. If we don't like you, we're going to sue you. So the Grand Lodge lost at trial, and the Cernoists made a big deal about this. But then the Grand Lodge appealed, and they won on appeal. And when they won on appeal, they won on a scorched earth policy. And they were not going to be sued by their own members. They were the ones in charge of Masonry in Ohio, and no one else could tell them how to run it. And just as a final footnote to that today, even today, if you are a visitor at a lodge in Pennsylvania, when you take the Tyler's Oath, you have to swear that you do not belong to a Cerno body, or you cannot visit lodge in Pennsylvania today.
Let's get into the actual reason you came down here, and I've as Masons often do, I've hoodwinked him into an extra duty for the afternoon. Let's talk Tyler's trivia. Do you have a trivia question you could share with the brethren that we could, for our monthly endeavor into the trivial?
Here's the question for you. What popular Christmas song has been recorded twice by 33rd degree Scottish Rite Masons and a smash hit with both versions?
If you think you know the answer, you send it to us at podcast@scottishrite.org. This is a putt, guy, the easy putt at that, fellas. So you should know this off the top of your head. And if I have to give a hint, Art hates giving hints, but since he's not here, I'm going to give one as a holiday gift. This song actually started as part of an advertising campaign for the Montgomery Ward department store. So there's your hint. And if you know the answer, podcast@scottishrite.org. Brent, thank you so much for coming down and chatting. It's always always enjoy doing it. And it's been far too long since we've had you on.
Thank you very much, Maynard. My pleasure to be with you. And Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to all the brethren listening in.
So mote it be. That's going to wrap things up for the Tyler's Place podcast for 2019. We thank all of you for joining us, and we hope you will join us next year in 2020 to continue your Scottish Rite and Masonic journey here with us. I'm Maynard Edwards, 32nd degree KCCH. From all of us here at the House of the Temple, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Holidays, and we'll catch you in 2020 right here on the Tyler's Place.